Ma chambre a la forme d'une cage. Le soleil passe son bras par la fenêtre. Les chasseurs à ma porte comme les petits soldats qui veulent me prendre. Je ne veux pas travailler, je ne veux pas déjeuner, je veux seulement oublier et puis je fume. Déjà
in the book Gamma of the Metaphysics, Aristotle advanced what is perhaps one of the few attempts to defend the principle, and he called it the Elenchos, some kind of a transcendental argument. Could you give us the gist of the argument?
Yeah, look, okay. Again, this is not straightforward. We're talking about a passage from Metaphysics Gamma, and it starts towards the end of book 3 and goes on into book 4. And what you find is there a sustained argument. Actually, there's a bunch of arguments for the law of non contradiction. A couple of things you might want to note about this. First of all, Aristotle does not take this to be a principle of logic. Okay? Aristotle's logic is found in the analytics, not the metaphysics. And the whole of metaphysics, Aristotle tells us, is about an analysis of being qua being. So however you interpret the principle of no contradiction, for Aristotle, it's a principle about reality, the nature of being. It's not anything to do with logic. Now, this is not characteristically how contemporary logicians, or at least logicians since Leibniz, have considered it, but it's the way that Aristotle thinks of it. This principle of metaphysics, not a principle of logic. Okay, second thing to note before we actually discuss the passages in question is that Aristotle, in Book Gamma of the Metaphysics, decides to enunciate and defend two principles of being qua being. The first of these is that no contradiction can be true. This is the principle of no contradiction. The second of these is the principle of excluded middle, which says that if you've got a pair of contradictories, at least one of them must be true. So the principle of excluded middle says at least one, and the principle of no contradiction says at most one. So this is what Aristotle does in that text of the Metaphysics. Now, people have focused less on his defense of the principle of excluded middle. And it's fair to say that even Aristotle thinks that non-contradiction is the more fundamental. There's another very strange passage in Aristotle, in another text, De Interpretatione, which is a rather notorious, chapter 9. It's about contingent statements about the future. And at least prima facie, what he seems to be saying in that is that if you get a contingent about the future, so his example was there'll be a sea battle tomorrow. But let's just take, I don't know, the number of deaths of coronavirus in New York will go up tomorrow. We don't know yet whether it will or won't. These are contingent statements about the future. Aristotle seems to say that these things might be neither true nor false. So you can have, it will go up and it won't go up, and neither of those is now true. By tomorrow it will be, but at the moment they're not. So there's good reason to think that Aristotle thinks the principle of non-contradiction more fundamental than the principle of excluded middle. And history has tended to follow him in this. As you mentioned in your introduction, the people who have thought that non-contradiction might fail are very, very few. But the people who thought that excluded middle might fail is much, much bigger. And in particular, if you look at contemporary logicians, it's a very, very standard move in many contexts. So it looks as though they're kind of dual principles, but it hasn't actually kind of worked out that way in the history of philosophy. And why that is an interesting question, but maybe we should pursue that at another stage. It's true that the most important part of that passage of Metaphysics is where he defends the principle of non-contradiction. And that's what you're asking about. So I'm sorry, that's been a rather long digression, but I thought it might be useful to put this thing in context. Okay, so in that passage, Aristotle enunciates the principle of non-contradiction. And you know, let's skip over all the niceties and keep things pretty simple. He enunciates the principle of non-contradiction, and then he says, well, it's so basic you can't prove it. All argumentation stops somewhere, and there's nothing more fundamental than this. And then he says something rather strange. He says, however, you can prove it by Elenchos. And what that is, it's a sort of technical term in logic or Aristotle's thought. But Aristotle kind of explains it. He says that you can prove it provided the person who you're arguing against will say something. Okay. So you can't sort of establish it from anything more fundamental, but at least if someone like me says, hey, some contradiction is true, you can sort of trash my argument. That's the Elenchos. And thereafter, there is a long and tortured argument. Let's come back to that in a minute. It runs, you know, maybe 2 or 3 pages of standard modern text. And to put it's fairly neutrally, it's tangled. I mean, it's not clear exactly what the argument is, to put it mildly. And so it's not clear that it works, because it's not clear how it works. But let's come back to that in a second. This is the major argument from the text. After that, you get about 6 or 7 small arguments. A lot of them are sort of one-liners or one-paragraphers. And some things are notable about these arguments. The first is the Elenchos has completely disappeared. So what on earth does Aristotle think he's up to? Because the Elenchos only seems to be relevant to the first long argument. The second point is that all the arguments after the one long main argument are beside the point. Because if you read the text, Aristotle has shifted gear. What he's defending in these smaller arguments is not the claim that no contradictions can be true, but the claim that not all contradictions can be true. Okay, let's suppose that not all contradictions can be true. That's quite consistent with some contradictions being true. And the long contradiction says it's not the case that some contradictions can be true. So Aristotle has kind of slid between some and all. And there's no explanation in the text for why this is. Scholars can speculate about this. In fact, it's even worse than that, because towards the end of this sort of grape shot of argument, Aristotle slides from defending the thought that it can't be the case that all contradictions are true to an even weaker claim: no one can believe that all contradictions are true. Maybe that's so, maybe that's not, but I mean, that's compatible with all contradictions being true, let alone some contradictions being true. So the grape shot arguments are pretty clearly beside the point. That leaves the one long argument, okay, which we haven't talked about yet. Okay, so I've been talking for a few minutes here. Before we look at the main argument, maybe you want to jump in on this.
As you like, well, now that you mentioned the view that every proposition is true or trivial is, we might we might move on to some logical aspects of contradictions and perhaps go back to the Elenchos after we said that in classical.
Up to you. How do you want to run things?
Well, let's continue for a bit talking about the Elenchos and see where we get.
Okay. All right. So let's talk a bit about the one long main argument.
Yeah.
And it really is long and it's tortured, and scholars don't agree on how to interpret it. I might say that what I'm saying about this passage in the Metaphysics is not simply my view. I mean, you mentioned Łukasiewicz, the Polish logician, who wrote a famous book in Polish in 1910, where he examines meticulously the arguments and comes to the conclusion they're all pretty worthless. And modern commentators, most of whom, of course, do subscribe to the principle of non-contradiction, also think that the passage is highly problematic, unclear, beside the point. So this, I mean, the contemporary scholarly evaluation of this passage is that it's not very good, to put it mildly. Quite a persuasive argument. Anyway, so let's return to this long passage. It starts with the Elenchos, and Aristotle says, okay, you know, I can't prove it, the principle of non contradiction to you, but if you'll say anything, I'll just trash your argument. Okay, I'll show that you have refuted yourself or something like that. And it turns out you don't actually have to say that anything, because as becomes clear in the text, all I've got to say is something meaningful, like man. Okay, so Aristotle says, okay, priest, say something. I say man. And he says, yeah, well, all right. Of course, that's ambiguous. You know, man is ambiguous. It might mean a human being, and it might mean someone with the male gender. And of course, someone could be a man and not man if you play with the ambiguity. Mm-hmm. So Angela Merkel is a man and not a man because she's a female but a human being. Okay, that's not interesting, right? I mean, it's an interesting fact that we choose to use the man ambiguously in that way. I mean, there are many interesting questions there, but that's not relevant at the moment. Mm-hmm. What's relevant is that, of course, if the meaning of the word man slides around, then of course you can have P and not P, something in its negation, in different senses of the words. Okay, that's boring. So Aristotle says, okay, well, let's fix on one definite meaning. Mm-hmm. And he says, let's say two-footed animal. That's kind of puzzling in itself, because the Aristotelian definition of a man is a rational animal. Mm-hmm. Why he fixed on two-footed animal, God only knows, but he does. But anyway, that's not really relevant either.
Yeah. We can choose the meaning that we want.
Yeah, fix on the meaning. He said, let's just fix it. And then there's a swift argument with a bit of modal logic in it. And it goes something like this. Well, if man means two-footed animal, then it can't be the case that something is a man and not a two-footed animal. So it can't be the case that something is a man and not a man, because man just means two-footed animal. Okay. So what you seem to have established is that it's not possible for that to be a man and not a man. Mm-hmm. And it would seem that Aristotle thinks this is kind of an example. It's only an instance of non-contradiction, one involving man. But it seems clear that Aristotle thinks you could do the same with any word you started with. Mm-hmm. But even that is contentious, because some commentators have argued that Aristotle intends the word you choose to be a substance word, an essence word. So we needn't go into the details too much, but Aristotle thinks that some words refer to a substance, whereas some refer to what medievals called an accident or merely a property. So if I say, if I ask you what you are, and I say you're a man, a person, right? That gives your essence. If I say what are you, you're a Brazilian. Well, that's an accident, right? And some scholars have suggested that Aristotle's argument works only, or that even Aristotle intended it to work only for these sort of substance terms, like man. Okay. Which is not what Aristotle explicitly sets out to do, but I mean, as I said, this is a very tortured passage, and scholars disagree about how to understand it. Okay, but set that complexity aside again. Assuming that everything is right so far, what Aristotle has established is it's not possible for something to be a man and not a man. And maybe that generalizes to all words. And you might think, hey, well, you know, that establishes the principle of non-contradiction. But this brings us back to this rather tricky issue that we started by talking about what you mean by the principle of non-contradiction. Let's agree that you can thus establish that it's not possible for something to be a man and not a man. It's yet quite open to a dialethist to hold that it can yet be the case that something is a man and not a man, and therefore that is possible. So, the fact that you've established that it's not possible for something to be a man and not a man is compatible for a dialethist to the thought that it's also possible that something is a man and not a man. So this is where it's tricky. Obviously, that that's not what Aristotle wants. That's not a move that Aristotle wants you to be able to make. Yeah. But it's hard to see how he can rule it out without begging the question. That argument, if indeed that's his main argument, looks to be question begging. And this is a phenomenon we've seen quite a lot over recent years. I mean, people have now started to give other arguments for the principle of non-contradiction, but they tend to beg the question. So that argument doesn't seem to be so good. And it might sound as I'm cheating to say, oh, it's not possible because it could be possible. Not necessarily, because something we'll presumably talk about in more detail later is how this relates to developments in modern logic. So, I mean, there's a kind of logic of which, as you know, sort of Brazil has played an enormous role in developing. That's paraconsistent logic. And if you look at various paraconsistent logics, which contain modal operators, that's words like must and man and can and so on. In many of these, that's exactly a contradiction of the contradiction that it can be the case and it can't be the case is exactly a contradiction of the kind that you find in these logics. So in that context, this isn't just a sort of technical point of begging the question, it's a serious issue, because there's a question being begged as to what kind of logic you can subscribe to here. And if you rule out the kind of logic that a dialethist is probably going to endorse, then of course that just begs the question. So, okay, that's kind of complicated, but I've tried to keep it as simple as I can.
That's perfect.